Somewhere in the American Southwest, in the summer heat of 1950, men were tearing the wrapping paper off tanks that were never supposed to fight again. Canvas covers came off. Cosmoline grease, thick and amber, was scraped out of gun barrels by hand. Engines that hadn't turned over in 5 years coughed, choked, and then caught. These were Sherman tanks. 5 years earlier, the United States had built more of them than any nation had ever built of any single tank in history. And then, when the war ended, it had tried to forget they existed. Now, halfway around the world, American soldiers were dying because that forgetting had gone too far. The tank that won World War II had been left to rust in the desert, and it would take a catastrophe on a Korean riverbank to drag it back into the light. To understand why this rescue mission happened at all, you have to go back to the moment the shooting stopped in 1945. America came out of the Second World War with an ocean of armor. Factories in Detroit, in Ohio, in Michigan had built tens of thousands of Sherman tanks in a handful of years, an industrial miracle that had genuinely helped win the war. But the moment Japan surrendered, that miracle became a liability. Nobody wanted to pay to store thousands of 30-ton machines. Nobody wanted to pay the soldiers to maintain them. The country wanted its factories back, its steel back, its young men back home and out of uniform. So the tanks went into storage, and storage very quickly became something close to abandonment. The Army didn't destroy every Sherman the way it scrapped so many other categories of surplus equipment. A portion of the fleet was preserved, parked in long, silent rows at depots scattered across dry regions of the country, chosen specifically because the low humidity slowed the rust that would have eaten the vehicles alive anywhere else. It was a reasonable, even forward-thinking decision. But reasonable decisions made in 1945 were about to collide with a reality nobody in Washington wanted to admit in 1950. The Army had preserved the machines. It had not preserved the readiness. By the time the decade turned, the army occupying Japan looked nothing like the force that had crossed France or fought through the Pacific. Budgets had been slashed again and again. The units stationed in Japan under General Douglas MacArthur's occupation command were configured for policing a defeated nation, not for fighting a modern mechanized war. Their tanks, where they had any at all, were M24 Chaffee light tanks, fast, cheap, easy to ship, and built for reconnaissance, not for slugging it out with heavy armor. Nobody expected them to need anything heavier. Nobody expected a war at all. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of June 25, 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea. And they didn't come with rifles and trucks. They came with tanks. Soviet-built T-34-85s, the very same design that had helped crush the German army on the Eastern Front, rolled south in columns of over 100, supported by infantry who had trained for exactly this kind of offensive. South Korean forces had almost nothing that could stop them, and the American occupation troops rushed in from Japan to help weren't much better equipped. The first American ground unit thrown into the fight became a symbol of just how unprepared the country really was. Task Force Smith, a scratch battalion rushed south from Japan in early July of 1950, met the North Korean advance near Osan, armed with little more than rifles, mortars, and 2.36-inch bazookas left over from the last war. When American soldiers fired those bazookas point-blank into the sides of advancing T-34s, the rockets bounced off. The weapon that had killed German tanks in Normandy could not even scratch the armor of a Soviet-built tank 5 years later. The task force was overrun within hours. Soldiers who had been told this would be a police action found themselves running for their lives from tanks they had no way to kill. Word of what happened at Osan raced back through the chain of command like an electric shock. Within days, senior officers were asking the same desperate question: where are our tanks? And the answer nobody wanted to hear was that most of the armor capable of standing up to a T-34 wasn't in Korea, wasn't in Japan, and in some cases wasn't even fully operational anywhere in the Pacific Theater. It was sitting in storage yards back in the continental United States, wrapped in preservative grease, exactly where the post-war demobilization had left it. This is where the story stops being about tank statistics and starts being about a decision made under real pressure, with real lives on the line every single day it took to make. Pentagon planners had to figure out, almost overnight, which tanks in the reserve fleet were even worth pulling out of storage. Not every Sherman variant would do. The version that mattered most was the M4A3E8, nicknamed the Easy 8 by the crews who loved it, a late-war refinement of the original Sherman design, fitted with a high-velocity 76mm gun and a wide-tracked horizontal volute suspension that gave it a smoother ride and better stability than earlier models. It wasn't a match for a T-34-85 in a fair fight on paper, but it was infinitely better than a bazooka and a prayer. And it existed, right now, in numbers nothing else did. So the order went out. Reserve depots across the Southwest began reactivating Sherman tanks that had not moved under their own power in years. Maintenance crews worked around the clock. Cosmoline, the thick, rust-preventing grease packed into gun barrels and engine components for long-term storage, had to be stripped out by hand, a filthy, exhausting job that could take hours per vehicle when it needed to take minutes. Batteries were dead. Rubber track pads had dried and cracked in the sun. Fuel systems needed to be flushed of years-old residue. Every single tank was a small engineering problem, and there were dozens of them needing solved at once, on a deadline measured in the lives of soldiers already fighting in Korea without adequate armor support. Some of these tanks had been sitting untouched since the final months of World War II. Crews reactivating them found 5-year-old newspapers stuffed into storage compartments, tools left exactly where a mechanic had set them down in 1945, personal items forgotten by crews who had gone home and never looked back. Bringing these machines to life felt less like military logistics and more like waking the dead. And in a very real sense, that's exactly what it was. Resurrecting a fighting force that the country had spent 5 years trying to convince itself it would never need again. While reactivation crews raced against the clock stateside, the situation in Korea kept getting worse. South Korean and American forces were falling back mile by mile, trading space for time, hoping reinforcements would arrive before the entire peninsula was lost. By August of 1950, what remained of the defending forces had been squeezed into a small corner of the southeast, anchored around the port city of Pusan and the Naktong River. Military historians would later call it the Pusan Perimeter, and it came astonishingly close to being the final line before total defeat. If the Sherman tanks did not arrive in time, there might not have been anywhere left for them to arrive to. And then, they started arriving. Ships loaded with reactivated Shermans crossed the Pacific and unloaded at Pusan's docks. And for the first time since the invasion began, American and South Korean forces had armor that could actually trade blows with a T-34-85 instead of simply dying in front of one. The Easy-8s rolled off the transports straight into combat, often with paint barely dry and crews who had trained together for only days. There was no time for a gentler transition. Tanks that had spent 5 years as museum pieces in waiting were suddenly the thin line standing between a defensive perimeter and total collapse. The results, when they came, were dramatic. Along the Naktong River in August of 1950, American Shermans engaged North Korean armor directly for some of the first times in the war, and for the first time, the outcome wasn't automatic slaughter in one direction. The high-velocity 76mm gun on the Easy-8 could genuinely hurt a T-34-85 at realistic combat ranges, something the earlier Chaffee light tanks and infantry bazookas simply could not do. It wasn't an easy fight. It wasn't a total reversal of fortune overnight. But it was the difference between a defensive line that could hold and one that could only run. But here's the part almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. The Shermans weren't alone for long, and in some ways, that's the more interesting twist. Even as the reactivated M4A3E8S were arriving and fighting, the army was scrambling to rush an even newer generation of armor into the theater. M26 Pershing heavy tanks, originally designed too late to see much action in World War II, and eventually the brand new M46 Patton. The Sherman's return wasn't the end of the story. It was a stopgap, a desperate bridge between a demobilized peacetime army and the modern force that Korea forced America to rebuild almost from scratch, in real time, under fire. That stopgap mattered enormously, though, because timing in war is everything. The M26 Pershings and M46 Pattons took additional months to arrive in meaningful numbers. The Sherman tanks pulled from those desert depots didn't have the luxury of waiting for something better to show up. They had to hold the line with what existed on the day the order was given, and for those crucial weeks along the Pusan perimeter, what existed was a tank that the country had already declared obsolete once. History has a habit of recalling the things it thought it no longer needed. There's another layer to this story that rarely makes it into the popular retelling, and it involves the crews themselves. Many of the men who climbed into those reactivated Shermans in the summer of 1950 were reservists, National Guard tankers, and young draftees who had trained on paper more than they had trained on tracks. Some had never fired a tank's main gun outside of a classroom demonstration. They were learning their machines and fighting a war for their lives in the same breath. Veteran World War II tank crewmen, some of whom had fought these very same Sherman variants across Europe or the Pacific just 5 years earlier, found themselves training green replacements in the days between reactivation and deployment, passing on hard lessons about ambush positions, sighting techniques, and keeping a cool head under fire that they themselves had learned the brutal way half a decade before. And there's a quieter irony buried in all of this too. The very same industrial base that had built these Sherman tanks in the first place, the same government that had ordered them into storage as quickly as possible after 1945 to save money, was now paying an entirely different kind of cost to bring them back. Emergency contracts were issued. Depot workers pulled overtime shifts. Spare parts that had been discontinued in post-war budget cuts had to be manufactured again from scratch or cannibalized from other stored vehicles. The peace dividend America had celebrated in 1945 came due with interest on a riverbank in Korea in 1950. By the time United Nations forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter in September of 1950 and pushed north, reactivated Shermans had become a permanent fixture of the American armored force in Korea, fighting alongside the newer Pershings and Pattons through the brutal battles that followed. The recapture of Seoul, the drive toward the Yalu River, and the long, grinding stalemate that eventually settled along a line not far from where the war had started. The tank that some planners had assumed belonged entirely to the last war ended up fighting through nearly all of this one too. What happened to those tanks afterward is its own quiet postscript. Some Shermans that fought in Korea were eventually retired for good once newer armor became available in sufficient numbers. Others were transferred to Allied nations as military aid, continuing to serve for years, sometimes decades, in the armies of countries far from where they'd rolled off American assembly lines. A handful survive today in museums and private collections, often unrecognized by visitors as the same tank designs that once sat forgotten in a desert depot before being dragged back into a war nobody expected. The larger lesson of this story reaches well beyond one tank or one war. Korea taught American military planners a hard truth that would shape defense policy for decades afterward. Mothballing weapons of war is not the same thing as maintaining the readiness to use them. You can preserve a machine. You cannot preserve the moment it was built for. Every conflict that followed, from Vietnam to the Gulf War to the wars of the 21st century, would be shaped in part by planners who remembered exactly how close the United States came to losing a war in its opening weeks, because tanks that could have made the difference were sitting quietly in the desert. And it took real blood on a real riverbank before anyone was willing to strip off the grease and bring them back. So the next time you see an old Sherman tank sitting in a museum courtyard, worn and outdated next to the machines that came after it, remember that this particular tank once got a second chance nobody expected to give it. It was built to win one war, shelved as obsolete, and then called back, in a moment of genuine desperation, to help save an entirely different one. There are details in this story that rarely make it past the history books and into public memory. And they're worth lingering on, because each one reshapes how you think about what actually happened that summer. The first is simple and almost hard to believe. Some of the Sherman tanks reactivated for Korea had never fired a shot in anger at all. They had rolled off the assembly line too late for World War II, been driven straight into storage, and sat there for years as brand new machines that had never once been tested in real combat. Their baptism by fire happened not in 1945 against the German army, but in 1950 against a Soviet-designed tank nobody had built them to fight. A weapon designed for one war ended up making its combat debut in an entirely different one. The second detail involves the paperwork itself. Reactivating a stored tank wasn't only a mechanical challenge, it was a bureaucratic one. Many of these vehicles had been formally struck from active inventory rolls, reclassified, and in some cases marked for eventual disposal once storage space ran short or budgets tightened further. Getting them back into fighting condition meant reversing years of administrative decisions almost as fast as mechanics were reversing years of rust and grease. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, a tank had already been written off as history before history called it back to work. A third detail concerns the crews who trained the new tankers. Some of the veteran instructors brought in to teach reservists how to fight in a Sherman again had fought in these same machines against German Panthers and Tigers in Europe, tanks that had outgunned and out-armored the Sherman for most of the war. Teaching young soldiers to survive against a T-34-85 with a tank that had once struggled against heavier German armor forced these veterans to relearn and reteach tactics on the fly, adapting lessons from one war for the demands of an entirely different one, half a world and 5 years away from where they'd first learned them. A fourth surprising thread runs through the supply chain itself. Spare parts shortages became so severe in the opening months of the war that some reactivated Shermans were kept running by cannibalizing components from sister vehicles that couldn't be repaired in time, a practice that had also been common in the deserts of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy years earlier. The exact same field expedient repair tricks that kept Shermans fighting against Rommel were quietly resurrected to keep them fighting in Korea. And the fifth detail is perhaps the most human of all. Letters and after-action reports from the period describe soldiers who recognized their tanks not by serial number, but by scars. Old battle damage patches, replaced hatches, mismatched paint from earlier repairs, evidence that the machine underneath them had already lived through a war before they ever climbed inside it. For some crews, riding into battle in Korea inside a Sherman that had already survived World War II felt less like driving a machine and more like inheriting one. None of this was supposed to happen. The entire post-war plan had been built on the assumption that the next major conflict, if it came at all, would be fought with newer equipment, better equipment, equipment that hadn't already proven itself obsolete once. Instead, in the summer of 1950, the fate of an entire defensive perimeter came down to how quickly grease could be scraped out of gun barrels that had been sealed shut since the last war ended. And it worked, not because anyone had planned it that way, but because the machines themselves, worn and outdated as they were, still had one more fight left in them. If you enjoy this World War II documentary, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.